People always ask me, when did I get into this food stuff? And my answer is always changing because I can't remember a time that food wasn't part of my everyday. But first, you should know a little bit about where I come from. So I was born and raised in Hell's Kitchen, not too far from here, but strangely renamed and gentrified as Clinton. In this neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen, we had access to things like a makeshift farmer's market, still there, a health food store, authentic Italian pizza, and greasy spoon Chinese food before greasy spoon meant serving through bulletproof glass windows. We had bodega items from Sonny's, like infinite varieties of candy and pickles sold in jars. And we had access to Thai food, where my mom would take me to celebrate academic achievement and birthdays. But all these things I'm telling you about are extras, because most of the things that I ate every day were made by my mom, by her hands, in our house. And unlike the television family that accompanied me during most of my dinners, milk wasn't something I drank with my food. In fact, adding chocolate to it didn't help eliminate that it came from a cow's titty. But fast forward 20 years from that dinner table, and all the mechanics of gentrification moves us out of our home. And we land in an outer borough, where recognizable options for good food have vanished. And it's not a constant reminder to people that unless you live there, culture shock can really take the place in the form of food disappearing. So in this new space, I'm no longer deliberating about what to eat. Now I find myself below an overhead, shadow-imposing iron horse named the number 7 train, thinking about what it is that I don't eat. And my choices below this train could be a shady supermarket, a $5 foot-long hero using boar's head, which is the elite meat of the hood, cow's tongue wrapped in plastic, and I swear in this moment I can see all 25,000 of his taste buds. And while I'm cringing, I scan the sticker of the pig's feet, and the date of sale is 3 weeks prior to the date I'm standing in front of it. And I could cross the street to the Chinese restaurant and order something, but that means I'd have to get my food through a bulletproof glass window and a turnstile where I put my money and my food comes spiraling out. But to imagine being served food in this way reminds me of that scene in the movie The Life of Pi, where Piscine attempts to feed Richard Parker the tiger through a fence, and his father scolds him for not realizing that the tiger is emotionless. He is an animal, you can't trust him. You can only feed him from a distance so you both survive. So the last two things existing on these 4 corners is a deli and a liquor store. So I know in this moment that if I wish to drink or smoke my hunger down, I'd have no problem there. So a few years pass, I become a PhD, a professor, I get married, I have 2 children who are now under 5, and so I'm ultimately compelled to find better food options for them. So one day, I watch my 3-year-old son watching the jovial but creepy clown whose red hair and yellow prison jumper on television seem predatory to me. But I exhale because my son doesn't know that those golden arches are the street signs of poverty, and I'm not ready to teach him that. So the hunt begins, but I realize that the hunt for food needs to start recruiting hunters, because so particular to this moment, the movement tends to exclude the very voices that it seeks to advocate for. So my goal is simple, to begin building an inclusive and united front that shares a vocabulary of struggle and of change. And as a result, the hope starts to produce, to continue working to recruit from all angles who can help us figure out things like food apartheid, food disparity, and all the variations of structural injustice, and ultimately illustrate that what the hunt is discovering and revealing is worth knowing by many. But before we get to these places, the well-intentioned have already been there, those kinds of hunters. And they come in with their healthy eating flyers with pictures of vegetables that none of us can recognize. And then they leave that very neighborhood. And the people are left behind. And no one knows among them how to sustain any of the projects that they've left, those do-gooders. because they weren't included from the ground up during this conversation. And once the salad is eaten at school, funding is lost, there are no greens left in the neighborhood, adults can never replicate this moment and call it dinner. So you can start with kids, and they are our hope, in hoping that the food struggle is eliminated eventually. But if we don't include people from the ground up, we've lost half the battle. Putting food on the plate versus what kind of food to put on the plate is a fight that many really don't know how to win. And we've been taught to think that time and poverty, when mixed together, is implosive. But residing in what I call the good food barren town, many have come to believe that those very golden arches that they see means they've arrived in America, not in poverty. So I began to recruit undergrads to help me hunt, to start the united front that I was dreaming up. And the first thing we encountered was loads and loads of food trucks. And not the food truck of the bourgeoisie. You guys know the kind. The ones with the sexy menu item names. The ones that wrap around a New York City block during a corporate lunch hour. No. In the good food barren town, these food trucks are home to meals like entire animals being served complete with innards, eyes, brains, and sits under a train station next to a trash can all day. And I won't apologize to anyone that is a fan of this truck, but I will argue that this shouldn't be people's only option for a meal night after night. So next we stop off at the supermarket. And at the door is a sale. 3 containers of salt for $2. And we notice that in this very neighborhood, there's no hospital or clinic relatively close by. And the stats at the CDC scream that food-sick health problems are running rampant in this zip code. So this same supermarket fooled people into believing that there's some dairy farm in the middle of Elmhurst, Queens. So people thought they were drinking local and not antibiotics. And you don't have to hunt to bump into the Sunny Delight, the orange juice of the hood, back again in my universe, this time in single drink containers, a 6-pack for $4.39. So my hunters and I, we decide to leave the boroughs for a few moments. And 2 hours and $35.50 each later, we landed in Cold Spring, hosted by the Glenwood and a lovely lady named Virginia. She gave my hunters a great tour and a lesson that left the pack completely inspired to grow their own food. Treated to fruit grown on site, a student asked me, "Dr. Bernard, have you ever tasted an apple so sweet?" And my response was, yes, but not often. Because in the hood, they serve you something like a grapple, which they try to trick us into thinking is a hybrid fruit. But if you live there, you know you can't trust food in the hood. So the departure from Cold Spring inspired us back into Queens, where we applied and was subsequently awarded a 2-acre vacant lot. Inspired by what the young farmers were doing in Cold Spring, we were going to grow some food. And we were going to replicate that model in our tiny little plot. We were going to re-educate all of the members of the good food barren town that they needed a new vocabulary, and we were developing a glossary of sorts. So ultimately, we were going to build this army. We were also going to combat childhood obesity in this neighborhood by including the children and their families to get down in the dirt, to grow with us, to learn with us, to eat with us, but specifically to fight alongside us. And ultimately, we'd get Mr. Softy off our block, and he'd take his asthma with him. And that predatory clown and his yellow prison jumpsuit would finally be charged with crimes against humanity. But 3 months and 2 acres later of preparation, of ready-to-grow food, I received a letter retracting the offer from the students. So we decided to do some volunteer work on another side of Queens to see how food was being grown. And after 10 a.m. at a volunteer day arrival site, included a farmer telling my hunters that the apples that she was picking were all organic. And as she picked it off the tree and bit it, she then turned to my students and admonished them for doing the same. Most of the major farm at the staff was white and young. Our tour guide mentioned that if we worked a full day, we too could receive some produce to take home. The language alone reminded me of the texts I've taught on indentured servitude among the Caribs and among the West Indians. Something like if we work all day, maybe they give we some food, and maybe if we behave good, we're gonna get for eat. So I looked around at my students and became immediately uncomfortable. We were all in a line, sweating, bent over, pulling up weeds, getting cut, bleeding, thinking about food, and working in complete silence. When a student said, "I really feel like a field Negro, Professor Bernard." And as we looked over where we stood, everyone, director, farmer, volunteers, administrators, tour guides, all white, sitting together, eating a farm-picked lunch. Angrily, as is my style, I walked over to the farmers and asked for drinks for my students who were so visibly hot. We were then pointed to the gift shop where water was $1.50 and coffee was $2. We had been hoodwinked and bamboozled. We paid a tour and volunteer fee, toiled their soil, left hungry, hot, and thirsty, and spent $12 plus transportation to do it. And I still didn't learn how to grow food. But what I did learn was how not to step on food that was being grown. So we limped over to a more accessible part of Queens, a rooftop farm a few blocks away from major transportation, and the idea, so ingenious, to grow food on top of a roof, inspired my hunters and I to think about returning to the elementary schools in New York City where we had gone and start growing food on top of those roofs, so central to the crack game, New York City 1980s. But was this deja vu? Because everyone here too was young, white, and innovative. And this stop was just a stop, because a tour would cost $150 of the site for the hour. We were running close to broke. And the alternative to paying that fee would have been to lead a self-guided tour, which you live in a food-barren town, you know you do that every day. So 3 trains later, at the crack of dawn, we entered a schoolyard in Brooklyn. Guess what? It wasn't deja vu on that roof. Everyone there was white too, including 56% of the enrolled children who attend that school. And the lesson of the day at that schoolyard ended with a teacher saying, "And that was how corn came to be grown all over a place like Mexico." So one of my hunters asked, "Where in Mexico exactly are we looking at this lesson?" And her response was, "Pick a location, it doesn't matter." Okay, so I guess that's how we got tacos in Texas. Time to go. So exhausted by my troops, I made a soon to final stop together. We left Brooklyn and we got to the South Bronx and met a lovely lady named Nancy, who ran La Finca del Sul. The first thing she did was offer us water, gave us a walking tour, and gathered the students near a handmade shed and told us how La Finca got started. Oral history at its best. Each of the students were given tasks, and then I was given one. My assignment was to recover some of the produce that was still edible. We were being given a chance to connect the dots. People who grow food, people who need food, and people who want food in their neighborhoods. And after 2 hours of diligent work, I noticed my students were engaged with each other, talking, laughing, and completely in full dialogue about food. And as it grew darker, we realized that although the hunt was far from over, we'd have to head home. So we turned in our baskets of recovered produce, and much to our humbling, members of the farm broke out plastic bags and gave us each groceries to take home. So while the hunt for food led us to unaffordable, questionably racist, elitist, and disconnected places, and their neo-hippie, well-intentioned leaders, I keep thinking about how many people don't have access to the opportunity, to the vocabulary, to the bravery or know-how on how to engage in this urban hunt for food. How poverty creates isolation, mistrust, distrust, and disconnection. And how many of us have begun to believe a television show teaches us something, although it points out that we are food have-nots. Many in the good food barren town accept what's presented to them, feed their families, whether off slow food or fast food menus, and hope for the best. While those who have access, words, projects that ignite and inspire, we ask you that united fronts continue the hunt, but we hope to develop a collective, an inclusive dialogue, one that engages the very people we seek to advocate, one that ignites their roots and shines a light on their culinary tradition and lets them cook their food with pride instead of watching someone else on television cook their food and gain a title for it. Members of the Good Food Baron Town need a movement of their own. The larger movement is exclusive and it's elitist, and it talks about problems without knowing what the problems are. And it tries to use the have-nots as pawns in this battle, when really it can be won by enlisting them at the start. The people need to know what tools they have access to so that we can run Mr. Softy out of our blocks and pelt him with our nebulizer machines. We need to get hunters to reclaim their roots, their root vegetables, their fruits of labor, their native dishes, their dignity, their humanity, their hunger, and their fulfillment. We need to hunt without heartache and despair, and we need to be empowered to join forces instead of opening our mouths just to hear someone else tell our story. Thank you.